Good morning, everyone. My intention this morning is to do a tour round the church. This first window is in memory of Catherine Rattenbury, and she was a head teacher, and her first school was down in Ebington Street. It was a private school for the sons of naval and military folk. So quite a respectable school, I would have thought there. As the gentry moved out of the city centre and up towards Manor, she went that way as well and finished up in Thorne Park. Then went over to Seymour Road to a house called Moorfield. And that's where the school actually took its name. She was head there for time, and then her daughter Caroline took over from her. When she died, they put this memorial up. So that was Moorfield School, sort of peaked really when she was there in 1904. But the most famous person after that was, I don't know if you recognise that, it's probably an ageist thing, but that's Angela Mortimer, actually. She went to the school. But that's probably the only real claim to fame of the school that was there. And the other thing about the Moorfield School is that the lectern over in the corner there that we don't use now, that's in memory of Miss Dallas, who was another teacher at the school. And that was put up in church here in the 1950s in memory of her. And then when the church was reordered in 1992, it was relegated to the cellar. Right. That's very quickly on that one. If we go up to the next one, it's always good to have a bit of gossip going on. And when the vicar comes along and marries the church warden's daughter, then that's always an interesting scenario. And that's exactly what happened at Emmanuel when the Reverend George Berry was here. Berry actually married Florence. And to say he was the daughter of Charles and Elizabeth Bewes. And I would like to say they lived happily ever after, but in fact she died at the age of 50. She was, very young. And George Berry, in his pastoral letter, said, "Of her life or work, by her own strong and sacred wish, not a word must be said, neither here nor in the church or when we commit her body to the ground, for the sake of disturbing the hearts and minds of the worshippers of the house. She was always unselfish and so thoughtful towards others. I thank God that she is now in paradise." So that is a husband speaking of Florence. And the parishioners actually raised the money for the window and the memorial there. Berry himself was a fascinating character. He was vicar here for over 30 years, but so different because he had time to go out on the moor, and he was a great archaeologist and actually discovered a stone circle out there on Langstone Moor. So unlike the busyness of being a rector these days, he sort of turned up here and then through the week, was elsewhere. And what's interesting about that is that he persuaded the Duke of Bedford to actually raise these stones up into a stone circle again. And that was all very positive until the Second World War, when the Americans were training on the moors and they used this stone circle as target practice. So if you go out to Langstone Moor now, you will not see the benefit of what George Berry actually discovered. He retired and then went supposedly to be a missionary in China, but there's no evidence that he actually arrived there. But he wrote one or two books about the Holy Land. In fact, died in Port Said, and his memorial is in the church there. The other interesting thing about George is that at the age of 76, he married again, Charlotte, who was 52, and in the records it says there were no children by his second marriage. So, I mean, it's nice how these little phrases get into the setup, so not really surprising on that. So that's a little bit about Florence and about George. Edmund Swain. HMS Ocean has always been a famous ship's name, and there is the one that he was actually in charge of. I think one of the few ships that has actually, under sail, gone round the Cape twice. And it spent all its working life in the Middle East. It was built at Devonport, and then he went to Hong Kong, and there was an outbreak of typhoid, and, well, they were put offshore, basically, and as captain, he actually died out there. And that tablet was erected by his shipmates. And as somebody pointed out to me yesterday, it's slightly unbalanced, as if there should be room for something else further down there. They had their house just at the entrance to Freedom Fields, on the right-hand side as you go in to Freedom Fields from the sort of Greenbank end. So whether the assumption was that when she finally passed, her name would come on there, I don't know. But it obviously didn't. So that's possibly why it is unbalanced there. So moving on again from high-ranking captain to the other end of the scale in some ways, is that it's consecrated to Richard Northmore, chief verger of the church, from its consecration 1870 to his death on Christmas Eve 1906, and his wife Elizabeth, for 30 years, butt woman, who died 4 years before him. Now, a butt woman is not a lady that keeps making excuses. A butt is, in fact, another word for the hassock or kneeler. And it was the title given to the verger's wife, basically, because the verger would look after the church, and the verger's wife would tidy up after him. So that's why she was a butt woman. They actually lived down at Lower Compton at the cottages in Henrietta Villas, tucked away up from the road that leads to Blandford Road. The name verger comes from the verge, which is a staff. So it's nothing to do with his actual duties. It's the fact he held a staff, or he held the verge, and therefore he was the verger. He was always very welcoming and always by the church, sitting in the back seat. And what was rather nice in 1992, the current verger, Jago, actually moved the Richard Northmore's seat plaque from one of the pews that was being removed right at the back. He has put it in the current back pew. We move on to the First World War now, and the Jago family. She's a solicitor in Plymouth, and unfortunately lost both their sons in the First World War. So they gave this chapel and screen as a memorial. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, on the 1st of July 1916, Edward Arthur Jago of the Devonshire Regiment was killed. And Edward Arthur Jago, if you look there, you can actually see that is not EJA, it is in fact EAJ, the J being in the middle for the Jago on there. And then 2 years later, we see we've got HH Jago, Major Henry Harris Jago. There's a lot more inside there, but I'm just going to leave it like that as an appetizer, and we'll go up into the chancel. Mary Pearn, when she died, her son Alonzo Pearn decided that we needed a decent memorial, and nothing less than William Morris would do. What's distinctive about William Morris is that he was the first artist to put glass edging round the panels of stained glass. And the net effect of that is that the whole of the glass stands, or the images stand out, where without that, they're a lot more drab. The window is all about the incarnation. William Morris, incidentally, only did this bit at the top here. His underlings did the others, Bryn Jones and the rest of it, but we like to call it a William Morris. The time this one was built, it was almost a pick and mix, and they had their catalogue. If we look at any of these, Samuel up here in a white robe. If you hop across to Calcutta, to the St Andrew's Church there is another William Morris window, and Samuel there is wearing green. So they had their sort of pick and mix catalogue. You had a particular design, and then you could pick the colours that you wanted. So that's William Morris in memory of Mary Pearn. And then we've got two more William Morris windows. This one, Alonzo Pearn himself did this one, the Adoring Angels. And then there was another death in the church of Thomas Rendle. So in memory of him, there was this one by William Morris. This is called the Te Deum window. So that was one bit of memory of Thomas Rendle. The other thing was the rear doss. Now, the rear doss is the bit behind the altar or the table. You look at it now, and that isn't what Rendle wanted or actually had there. Now, if you look at that, you can see what the rear doss did look like. You can see that there was stone arches, and above it there was stenciling. The other interesting thing on that picture is the central heating system that you see there. Those large pipes, presumably very hot, completely unprotected from anybody touching it. You also notice there, before 1992, there were 3 steps coming up to here, but since we reordered and had the dais, they are still there, but we don't notice it. So it's a slightly different look. So that was what Thomas Rendle, widow, organised, and that was actually all ripped out in the late 1940s. It was done, the whole area here is a memorial to the Second World War dead. The first one that we look at, Melvin Holmes, his parents decided to give the whole of the back as a memorial to him. He was a Second World War pilot, survived the Battle of Britain, but then was killed in 1944. That was the first bit for the back of the screen. And then the Winicotts, who also lost a son in the Second World War, on a raid to Dieppe, to Richard Winicott. He actually went to HMS Quebec, which is a land station in Scotland, for special operations. And then he was on the raid of Dieppe. We think he was probably steering or landing craft. But what is fascinating, or I find fascinating, I mean, Dieppe was an absolute disaster. But without the disaster of Dieppe, we wouldn't have had the success of D-Day, because a lot was learned from it. But the fascinating bit about Robert Winicott is that he is buried in a Canadian graveyard in the German style. Now, let me unpack that a little bit. The Canadians were the ones that were actually doing the raid, and he happened to be British and steering the boat, basically. And he was killed along with the other, or some of the Canadians. So they were all put in the graveyard together. They were actually buried by the Germans afterwards, because, of course, we weren't there to bury. And the German tradition is that you bury people head to head. So you have the 2 headstones the other way, and then a gap, where we tend to do it all the same way. Now, after the war, when we took over the graveyards, because they were buried there, we then put the right headstones up, or the proper, traditional Commonwealth headstones up. But it's the only Commonwealth grave that actually has this pattern of gravestones there, which is, an interesting quirk on that. So that's the Winicott on that side. And then on this side, this was the uncle of this Winicott, and he died in the First World War. So because the Winicotts were paying, the Winicotts paid up to here on each side. The Holmes paid for that bit, and then the Winicotts did this bit and this bit. And Russell Winicott died. They lived in Bainbridge Avenue, number 11. And when he died, his parents left the bedroom exactly as it was. And it's all First World War relatives received what was nicknamed the death penny, which is this here. It's a medallion that was given. That stayed in Russell's room for as long as his parents lived in that house. And then the house was sold, and when Colin May, who lives there now, was clearing things out, in the garage, he actually found the death penny. And he kept that for many years in the house. 3 years ago, day service, we actually installed that. So that's his actual a death penny there at the side. Right, the death penny was the medal or the medallion. No, I haven't. But you can see on it had the dead person's name on it and Britannia. And then the rest of the panelling here, the congregation actually paid for. But that was a time where Victorian memorabilia was not appreciated. But what is left are these 2 stone finials. That's all that remains of the Rendle Memorial. Each generation doesn't appreciate the previous generation, but loves the generation before that generation. So there will be a time when we're not here that we'll be loved. That was the incarnation window. This is the resurrection window, best seen at midday when it's sunny. And this was given to the church by the Inspector General of Hospitals and Fleets in memory of his wife, Sophie. He was also an honorary surgeon to Queen Victoria, so he was quite an important chap, and is buried in Ford Park Cemetery, James. I'm whizzing on now because I'm not achieved my objective of doing this within half an hour, I'm afraid. So let's come on down. Now, this window here, in memory of Maria Ann Easthorne Jackson, is quite interesting for 2 reasons. One of the reasons is that she died on the feast of St. Paul, and she was born on the feast of St. Thomas. And so in this window, we have St. Thomas and St. Paul. And because that was the situation there, all the other windows then have the apostles. The other interesting thing there, we see that he was the wife of Samuel Jackson. And then if we have a look in this window here, we see that this is in memory of Samuel Jackson, given by his widow. And you think, how can he memorialise her and her memorialise him? How do you get your head round that? Well, the reality is he married again. And it's not the same, well, he is his widow, but not the same one. 2 more things. Let's go to the tower. Now, this memorial here is in memory of the headmaster of Compton School that drowned in 1897, I think 1897, yes, attempting to save his son and his son's friend. This was the memorial that was done for them. I say it's the memorial, it's not the same window. This window was completely vandalised in the 1960s and then reinstated. Book of Learning and the Light of Knowledge are there. And I thought that they had actually put it back like it was. And then in the newspaper years ago, this was there, which was 2 married couples celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, 2 twins. There's a picture there of the original window. So I got in touch with them, and they did have a colour picture of the window. It may seem rather drab compared with that, but what is very noticeable in there is the brightness of the light, which was the whole point of the window. But here, right, the lantern is there, but it's just part of the rest. The impact is lost, wanting to make it brighter, more light in here. But the significance really is the lantern there that just sort of stands out. It was basically Victorian drab glass, making the emphasis of what was important. But you can have too much of a good thing, so you lose what the point it is there. So that's what I think is fascinating about that one, that it was restored, but not really restored. And I would like to think that the person did that, because if they knew what the significance of the light there, then they would have done it differently. Finally, the First World War memorial window. As you heard me mention before, the east window was the incarnation, the birth of Christ. The window on that side was the resurrection. And it was always the intention to have this as the Good Friday, the crucifixion window, the sacrificial window. And I think it's quite interesting that that didn't actually happen. We haven't got a depiction there of Christ on the cross, but we certainly do have a memorial here for the First World War dead, which was their sacrifice. So in an odd sort of way, it does link in. It is still a sacrificial window. There's the names there of the 94 of the parish that died. And then 2 years ago, somebody phoned up and said, do you know anything about the history of my great uncle? And when I searched it, although the church had great efforts to put all the names up, we found that Fleming was not there. So there, we added that 18 months ago. And that's why that's not in alphabetical order, because it's actually at the end. So that was an addition. You think you've got it all. They had great efforts, actually, these are people of the parish, geographical parish, not necessarily of the worshipping congregation, although they were probably very much the same. It's interesting that as a memorial, they were debating whether to build a hall for the ex-servicemen's club, whether they would actually use the money for homeless children. But in the end, they decided to have this memorial. And it's quite interesting because I think my mindset would be to use the money for something useful. And yet, if it had been used for a useful purpose 100-odd years ago, we would not have the benefit. There would not be one sense, a living memorial here for future generations to appreciate the sacrifice. But it's always an interesting debate of do you have something that will be there almost forever, or do you actually help on there? You've got there the four patron saints and Christ in the middle. The patron saints, we've got George, David, Andrew, and Patrick. And as you all know, Patrick there, the snakes are at the bottom because there are no snakes in Ireland. So he got rid of the snakes in Ireland, apparently. So anyway, there's that. I've gone over my time. But I hope that gives you a little buzz around. All right?